My son used my credit card to buy expensive Christmas gifts for his wife's parents. When I quietly asked if there was anything under the tree for me, he barely looked up from his coffee. He shrugged and said, "I forgot to get you anything." His wife let out an awkward little laugh and added, "We'll make it up to you next year." I didn't argue. He didn't remind him that the gifts around the tree had been paid for with my own credit card. He simply zipped my jacket, wished everyone a Merry Christmas, and walked out the front door. The next morning, I removed both of them from my trust. 15 minutes later, my daughter-in-law called asking if I could wire them $15,000 for an emergency. By bedtime, my son had 48 missed calls from me. Not because I wanted to talk, because every one of those calls came from my attorney's office. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 68 years old, a widower, and until that Christmas, I believed I had a good relationship with my only child. Looking back, I realize I confused peace with love. They aren't always the same thing. For almost 40 years, I owned a heating and air conditioning company outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well. My crews installed furnaces in freezing winters, repaired air conditioners during 90-degree summers, and answered emergency calls on holidays while everyone else was home opening presents. He was proud of that business, even prouder that I sold it honestly when I retired. After taxes and investments, I had more than enough to live comfortably without ever becoming one of those wealthy men obsessed with money. Money had always been a tool, never the goal. My wife Susan believed the same thing. She passed away 8 years before the story begins. Cancer, the kind that gives you hope just long enough to break your heart. Before she died, she squeezed my hand and whispered something I've never forgotten. "Take care of Michael, but don't let loving him become protecting him from life." At the time, I promised her I would. He meant every word. Unfortunately, keeping promises and understanding them are two very different things. Michael was 38 that Christmas. He worked in commercial real estate. His wife Emily taught part-time at a private preschool. They weren't poor, far from it. They lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom home 20 minutes from mine. Two new SUVs sat in the driveway. They took vacations every summer. Their 2 children attended private school. From the outside, they looked like the picture-perfect American family. What almost nobody knew was how many times I'd quietly stepped in over the years. When Michael graduated from Ohio State with student loans, I paid them off. When he wanted to buy his first house, I covered the down payment. When Emily wanted to stay home after their first child was born, I quietly sent them money every month for nearly a year. When Michael's first business partnership failed, I wrote a check that kept him from declaring bankruptcy. He never asked for repayment. Not once. Every birthday, every Christmas, every anniversary, I tried to make their lives easier. Maybe too easy. A year before Christmas, Michael called with what sounded like a reasonable request. "Dad, would you mind adding me as an authorized user on one of your credit cards? Strictly for emergencies. What if something happens while we're traveling with the kids?" It seemed practical. It wasn't asking for cash. It wasn't asking to borrow money. It simply wanted the ability to handle an emergency if I couldn't be reached. He agreed without hesitation. After all, he was my son. The card had a generous limit. He barely used it except for travel and occasional large purchases. He trusted him completely. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. Snow covered the lawns throughout their neighborhood. Children were already outside building snowmen while parents carried coffee mugs from garage to garage, wishing one another Merry Christmas. I arrived around 9 o'clock carrying homemade cinnamon rolls, Susan's recipe, and wrapped presents for everyone. Emily hugged me. The grandchildren tackled my legs before I could even take off my coat. For a while, everything felt normal. The kids opened bicycles, video games, books, board games. He enjoyed every minute of watching them laugh. Then Emily's parents arrived. The mood changed. Michael suddenly became almost performative. He insisted everyone gather around while his father-in-law opened an expensive Rolex. His mother-in-law received a designer handbag she'd admired months earlier. There was a luxury weekend spa package, a 70-inch television, kitchen appliances. Gift after gift, Emily cried. Her parents kept saying, "You two shouldn't have." Michael smiled proudly. "You deserve it." He remembers sitting quietly in my chair, smiling because they seemed genuinely happy. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't counting presents. But after nearly an hour, the tree was empty. Everyone had opened something. Even the grandchildren's stockings were overflowing. He looked around. Nothing remained. He honestly thought maybe mine had been left in another room, so I asked softly, "Should I wait until later?" Michael frowned. "For what?" He smiled. "My gift." He blinked once, then shrugged. "Oh, I forgot to get you anything." Emily gave a nervous laugh. "We've just been so busy." Nobody said another word. Even the grandchildren looked confused. He felt something inside me grow strangely quiet. Not angry, not embarrassed, just finished. I stood up, put on my coat, zipped my jacket, and picked up the empty tray that had held Susan's cinnamon rolls. "Merry Christmas, everybody." Michael didn't even stand. Emily simply said, "Drive safe." That was it. Oopsie, the cold air hit my face harder than I expected. He sat in my truck for several minutes before starting the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, my phone buzzed, then buzzed again and again. At the first red light, I glanced down. 3 credit card notifications had arrived. He almost ignored them. Instead, I opened the app. My stomach tightened. The purchases had posted overnight. A luxury jewelry store, an upscale department store, a designer boutique. Total charges just over $8,700. Every purchase matched the gifts I'd watched Emily's parents unwrap. Bought 4 with my credit card. He stared through the windshield as snow drifted across the road. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because for the first time in my life, the truth was impossible to avoid. They hadn't forgotten me. They had remembered me just enough to use my money. The next morning, I called my attorney before I poured my first cup of coffee. "Richard," I said quietly, "I'd like to make some changes to my trust." There was a long pause. Then he replied, "I'll have my office ready for you in an hour." I looked once at the family photo sitting beside Susan's old wedding ring. He should have done this years ago. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply said, "I'll see you soon." And somehow I already knew Christmas had ended far more than a holiday. It had ended an illusion. Richard Collins had been my attorney for 23 years. He wasn't just the man who handled my estate planning. He had become a trusted friend, the kind who knew when to ask questions and when silence was the better gift. When I walked into his office the morning after Christmas, he took one look at my face and pushed a fresh cup of coffee across the conference table. "You look like you didn't sleep." I didn't. He nodded. I figured. He didn't rush me. Didn't they ask why I'd called before 8 o'clock on the day after Christmas? Instead, he opened my trust documents and waited. Finally, he said quietly, "Tell me what happened." He slid my phone across the table. I read the credit card statements first. Then, he looked at the photographs I'd saved from Emily's Facebook page. There they were, her parents smiling beside the Rolex, holding expensive shopping bags, posing in front of the television. The captions read, "Best Christmas ever. Feeling so blessed. Our daughter and son-in-law spoiled us." Richard looked up. "They used your card. They were authorized users and they bought you nothing." He removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I've represented families for over 30 years, Daniel. Saif. I've learned that inheritance doesn't usually destroy relationships. What does? Entitlement." That word stayed with me. Entitlement. Maybe because I'd spent years pretending it wasn't growing inside my own family. The truth was Christmas hadn't created this problem. It had simply exposed it. Driving home from Richard's office, memories kept surfacing like old photographs floating to the top of a lake. The first one was 20 years earlier. Michael had just graduated from Ohio State. He sat across from me in a diner, looking defeated. "Dad, I've got almost $60,000 in student loans." "I know. I'll be paying these until I'm 40. Susan reached under the table and squeezed my hand. "We'd already talked about it. That afternoon, I paid every dollar." Michael cried. He hugged both of us. "I'll never forget this." He meant it. At least I believe he did back then. A few years later, he called again. "Dad, I found the perfect house." "Congratulations. The bank approved the mortgage, but we're short on the down payment." Susan looked at me. He already knew what she was thinking. Help him. We wrote another check. Michael promised. "I'll pay you back." He smiled. "No, you won't." He laughed. "I mean it." "I know." He hugged us again. Susan smiled all the way home. Helping our son felt good. It felt like parenting never really ended. Neither of us realized we'd started removing every obstacle life placed in front of him. Then came the failed business. He'd invested with a friend who turned out to be reckless with money. Michael called late one Friday night. "Dad," his voice cracked. "I think I'm going to lose everything." By Monday morning, I'd transferred enough money to settle the debts. He kept his house. His marriage stayed intact. His credit remained excellent. Everyone praised how responsible he'd been during a difficult situation. Only two people knew the truth. Susan and me. After Susan died, the requests became more frequent. Nevero trajes, just constant. "Dad, daycare is expensive." "Dad, Emily's car needs repairs." "Dad, property taxes surprised us." "Dad, we're trying to refinance." "Dad, can you help with the kids' tuition?" Every request sounded reasonable individually. Together, they painted a different picture, one I'd refused to see. He missed Susan terribly. Helping Michael made me feel like she was still part of our lives somehow. Looking back, maybe I wasn't helping him. Maybe I was comforting myself. A week after Susan's funeral, I'd stood alone in our bedroom holding one of her sweaters. He remembered something she'd said years before while we watched Michael struggle through high school. "You know what worries me?" "What?" "You're always ready to rescue him. That's what fathers do." She smiled sadly. "No, they teach their children how to rescue themselves. At the time, I thought she was being too hard on him. Now, I wondered if she'd seen something I refused to acknowledge. Richard interrupted my thoughts by sliding new paperwork toward me. I've drafted the revisions. He read each page carefully. Michael removed as a primary beneficiary. Emily removed entirely. The grandchildren remain protected, not through their parents. Direct educational trusts, college, trade school, medical emergencies. The money could only be used for them, not by them, and certainly not by their parents. The rest of my estate would be divided among several organizations that had quietly mattered to Susan and me for years. A children's hospital, a scholarship fund for students entering skilled trades, a veterans housing program, our local church food pantry. Richard watched me reading. You've thought this through. I have. You understand this decision could permanently damage your relationship with your son? He looked out his office window. Cars rolled slowly through the snowy streets of downtown Columbus. Parents carried shopping bags. Children laughed while throwing snowballs. Christmas was ending for everyone else. Mine had ended yesterday morning. I don't want to punish Michael. Richard waited. I want to stop enabling him. He smiled faintly. Those are two very different things. He signed every page one after another. When I finished, Richard placed the documents into a folder. It's done. He expected relief. Instead, I felt sadness. Not because of the money, because every signature acknowledged the truth I'd spent years avoiding. My son loved me. He believed that. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped respecting the sacrifices behind the help. He had barely reached my truck when my phone rang. Emily. He almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Hi, Ad. I hope I'm not bothering you. No, actually. She laughed softly. We've got kind of an emergency. What happened? Well, she hesitated. We found the perfect SUV. He frowned it. An emergency SUV? She laughed again. You know what I mean? Not really. The dealership has this year-end sale, but we need $15,000 today for the down payment. He leaned back against the truck. Yesterday, she'd watched me leave her house without a single Christmas gift. Today, she wanted $15,000. No apology, no acknowledgement, just another request. So, she continued, could you wire it today? For years, I would have answered before she finished asking. Instead, I looked up at the gray December sky, thought about Susan, thought about Richard's single word, entitlement. Then I spoke, no. Silence. Long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry. What? He said, no. You've never said no before. I know. Anoté long pause. Then her voice changed. The sweetness disappeared. Is this about yesterday? No, it's about the last 20 years. She didn't answer. He was about to end the call when she asked the question that told me everything I needed to know. Her voice was cautious now, almost nervous. You're still leaving everything to Michael someday. She stopped, then quietly finished. Right. I closed my eyes. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel guilty. He simply ended the call. I didn't hear from Michael for the rest of that afternoon. No texts, no voicemail, no apology, only silence. The strange thing was I didn't spend the day waiting for my phone to ring like I normally would have. Instead, I drove to the cemetery. Susan always loved the quiet after Christmas. She used to say the day after the holiday was when people finally stopped performing and started being themselves again. I brushed a thin layer of snow from her headstone and stood there with my hands buried in my coat pockets. "No," I whispered. The wind drifted through the bare oak trees. For a moment, I almost imagined her smiling. Not because our family was falling apart, because I'd finally started telling the truth. The knock on my front door came just after 6 o'clock that evening. I already knew who it was. Michael never knocked softly. 3 sharp pounds, a pause, then 2 more. He opened the door. I stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Emily followed him with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Neither one looked angry anymore. They looked confused. "Dad," Michael began. Emily said, "You hung up on her." "I did. She was just asking for help." "I know," he frowned. "So, what's going on?" I looked at both of them for several seconds, then I walked into the living room. "If we're going to have this conversation, let's sit down." Nobody spoke while we settled into our chairs. The grandfather clock Susan had bought for our 25th anniversary ticked steadily in the corner. Michael finally broke the silence. "If this is about forgetting your Christmas gift," I raised my hand. "It's not." Relief flashed across his face. Then I reached into the folder Richard had given me earlier that day. "I'd like you to look at something." He slid several sheets of paper across the coffee table. Michael barely glanced at them. "What is this?" "Credit card statements." He looked again, his expression changed. Emily leaned over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The pages showed every charge. December 23rd, the jewelry store, the department store, the electronics retailer, the designer boutique. Each purchase was highlighted. Each purchase had been made using my account. Michael slowly looked up. "You checked the statements?" "I did. I was going to tell you when." I hesitated. "I don't know. Before or after the bill arrived?" His shoulders dropped. "Dad, I trusted you." Emily suddenly jumped in. "We were going to pay you back." He looked at her. "Were you?" "Of course." "When?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Michael rubbed both hands across his face. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "What wasn't?" "The card got declined on my business account." "So, you used mine just temporarily for nearly $9,000. We were going to replace it." He nodded slowly. "And while you were replacing it," I leaned forward, "you forgot to buy your own father a Christmas present." Nobody answered. The silence was louder than any argument. Finally, Michael sighed. "I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this." That sentence surprised me more than the credit card charges. Not because it was cruel, because he genuinely believed it. He asked quietly. "You really don't understand. It was just one Christmas." "No," I shook my head. "It wasn't," he frowned. "Then what was it?" "It was 40 years. Both of them stared at me. That I stood up and walked toward the bookshelf. Framed photographs filled the shelves. Susan holding newborn Michael. Michael's little league team, his college graduation, our family vacation in the Smoky Mountains, his wedding, his children's birthdays. Every picture represented another season of our lives. He picked up one photograph from his graduation. You remember this day? I smiled faintly. Of course. You remember who paid your student loans? His smile disappeared. You did. The house you helped the failed business. You loaned me money. It wasn't a loan. I looked away. The daycare bills? He didn't answer. The private school tuition? Still nothing. The roof after the hailstorm. Emily quietly lowered her eyes. The medical bills when Lily broke her arm. Michael whispered. I know. No, I said calmly. You remember. Knowing and remembering aren't the same thing. He returned to my chair. You know what hurts the most? He looked at me. I don't care about the money. I care that somewhere along the way, I paused. You stopped seeing it as mine. His face tightened. I never thought that. Really? Jube always had plenty. There it was. The sentence I'd been hearing in different forms for years. Jube always had plenty. As though having enough somehow erased ownership. He smiled sadly. Exactly. What? You've had access to my help for so long? He pointed toward the statements that you stopped seeing generosity. You started seeing availability. Emily finally spoke. We didn't think you'd mind. He nodded. I know. She looked surprised. You know, Jace, that's exactly the problem. The conversation went nowhere after that. Michael insisted they hadn't intended to hurt me. Emily repeated that they would have paid every penny back. Neither one understood why trust mattered more than reimbursement. Eventually, they left. Not angry, not apologetic, just frustrated. As if I had suddenly changed the rules of a game we'd been playing for years. The truth was I had. 2 days later, my phone began buzzing with messages. Not from family, from old friends. One text read, "Everything okay?" I noted heard something strange. Give me a call. He had no idea what they were talking about until my neighbor Frank stopped by while I was shoveling snow. He leaned on his shovel and cleared his throat. Daniel. Yet, I don't want to gossip. Then don't. It chuckled. Fair enough. He hesitated, but Emily posted something online. He frowned it. What kind of something? Frank pulled out his phone. She didn't mention your name. He handed it to me. The post read, "It's heartbreaking when older family members suddenly become controlling with money. Sometimes aging changes people and all you can do is pray for them." Hundreds of reactions, dozens of comments. Most people assumed she was talking about one of her relatives. Only a handful knew it was me. He handed the phone back. I see. Frank looked uncomfortable. I figured there was probably another side. There usually is. 3 days later, I received an unexpected visitor. My 12-year-old grandson, Ethan. He rode his bicycle through the slushy streets despite the cold. When I opened the door, he looked nervous. Hi, Grandpa. Hi, Buddy. Can I come in? We sat in the kitchen drinking hot chocolate. After several minutes, he quietly asked, "Are you mad at Dad?" He chose my words carefully. "I'm disappointed," he nodded. I didn't know. Didn't know what? That you didn't get anything for Christmas. He looked down into his mug. That told us you said you didn't want presents anymore. He felt something twist in my chest. I never said that. His eyes widened. I knew it. You did? In Native. It didn't sound like you. Then he reached into his backpack. I made this. He handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside it was a pencil drawing. The two of us fishing at Allen Creek 3 summers earlier. At the bottom, he'd written best grandpa ever. I couldn't speak for several seconds. Finally, I managed. Thank you. Ismail. I wanted you to have a Christmas present. He hugged him tighter than I probably should have. As he stood to leave, he stopped at the front door. Grandpa? Yeah. He looked around to make sure nobody else was listening. Then he whispered, Dad's been telling everyone you're getting forgetful. He felt the room go completely still. And for the first time since Christmas morning, I realized this story wasn't just about money anymore. I didn't sleep much after Ethan left. Not because of the trust, not because of the money, because of one sentence. Dad's been telling everyone you're getting forgetful. He kept hearing it over and over. Forgetful. It was a clever accusation. If people believed I was losing my memory, then anything I said about the credit card, the Christmas gifts, or the trust could be dismissed as confusion instead of fact. He'd seen it happen before. A friend of mine had started showing early signs of dementia several years earlier. At first, his own children genuinely worried about him. But after his diagnosis, people stopped questioning anything they said on his behalf. They handled his finances. They made decisions for him. Most of them acted honorably. But I'd also heard stories where that trust had been abused. He never imagined my own son would plant that kind of doubt about me. The following Monday, I met Richard for lunch. He listened without interrupting while I told him everything Ethan had said. When I finished, he folded his hands together. Have you had a recent physical? I had one 3 months ago. Cognitive screening? I asked for it. Ismail. I thought you might. My doctor said my memory was above average for my age. Richard nodded approvingly. Good. Why? Because if this gets uglier, he stopped. Having documentation matters. You don't want to fight. I know. But sometimes protecting yourself isn't the same as starting one. Later that afternoon, I stopped by my family doctor's office. Dr. Karen Mitchell had treated Susan and me for nearly 20 years. She greeted me with a warm smile. What brings you in, Daniel? You were just here. I need copies of my last physical. She raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? My son has been telling people I'm becoming forgetful. Her expression changed immediately. I'm sorry. So am me. She disappeared into her office for a few minutes before returning with my records. Every cognitive assessment, every lab result, every physician's note. Healthy, independent, no signs of cognitive decline. She placed the folder in front of me. You know, she said gently, sometimes aging parents end up defending themselves when they shouldn't have to. He smiled sadly. I never thought I'd become one of them. 2 days later, the consequences of Christmas started reaching people outside our family. Ironically, not because I told anyone, because Michael's father-in-law did. His name was Robert, a retired electrician, good man, hardworking, the kind of person who'd rather fix something than argue about it. Around noon, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. Daniel speaking. This is Robert, Emily's father. His voice sounded unusually heavy. I'd like to stop by if that's okay. Of course. I arrived an hour later carrying a black gift bag. Neither of us mentioned Christmas at first. We sat in the living room drinking coffee. Finally, he slid the bag across the table. "I think this belongs to you." Inside the Rolex, still in its original box. He looked up. "I don't understand." I asked Michael where he bought it. Robert sighed. "He admitted he used your credit card." I rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought he bought these gifts himself." "You didn't know?" "No." I shook his head firmly. "And if I had," he pushed the watch closer, "I'd never have accepted it." He looked at the box for several seconds. "You don't have to return this." "Yes, I do." I smiled sadly. "My father taught me something when I was a kid." "What was that?" "If receiving a gift cost someone their dignity," he stood, "it's not really a gift." For the first time in weeks, someone else's words made me feel understood. Robert wasn't the only one asking questions. Emily's mother called her that evening. Apparently, she'd learned the truth from her husband. The conversation did not go well. He only knew because Emily accidentally called me instead of Michael the next morning. The call lasted barely 5 seconds, long enough for me to hear shouting in the background. Then it disconnected. I didn't call back. So many conversations belong to the people having them. By the end of the week, several relatives had quietly reached out. Not to take sides, to understand. My younger sister, Linda, invited me over for dinner. Halfway through the meal, she asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did you really cut Michael out of your trust?" "I did," she nodded slowly. "I figured." "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." That caught me off guard. She reached across the table. "Daniel, you've been rescuing him since he was 16. I thought I was helping." "You were." She smiled kindly until helping became expected. Her words sounded almost identical to Richard's, almost identical to Susan's. How had everyone seen it except me? Meanwhile, Michael's financial life began unraveling. Not because I wanted revenge, because he'd built his future assuming my safety net would always be there. Several months earlier, he'd begun negotiating the purchase of a small commercial office building with 2 business partners. The deal depended on his personal financial statement. One afternoon, he showed up at my house carrying a folder. I looked exhausted. "Dad, what is it?" "The bank wants updated estate documentation." He said, "Nothing." "They always counted your trust as part of my long-term financial position." He finally understood. The inheritance hadn't simply been a future hope. It had become part of his financial planning. He'd borrowed confidence against money that wasn't his. "I can't help you." His shoulders slumped. "If this deal falls apart, it wasn't your building yet. But it could have been." He looked him straight in the eye. "It also could have been my retirement." He didn't answer because he knew I was right. Over the next several weeks, my life became unexpectedly peaceful. The phone stopped ringing every few days with another request. Nobody asked me to cover tuition. Nobody needed emergency repairs. Nobody wanted help with vacations. For the first time since Susan died, my calendar belonged to me. He started volunteering twice a week at a veterans resource center downtown. Most of the men there didn't care what I'd done for a living. They wanted someone who would listen. He also began mentoring young people entering the skilled trades through a local apprenticeship program. Watching 20-year-olds work hard for their first paychecks reminded me of myself decades earlier. They were hungry, determined, grateful. Those qualities had become strangely refreshing. The brightest part of my week, however, arrived every Saturday morning. Ethan, sometimes his little sister Lily, came too. Their parents believed they were simply visiting Grandpa. They never asked many questions. We fished when the weather allowed, built birdhouses in my garage, worked on an old lawn tractor I'd promised to restore with Ethan. One afternoon, while tightening a bolt together, Ethan looked up and asked, "Grandpa?" "Yeah." "Are grown-ups supposed to say thank you?" He smiled. "I hope so." He nodded thoughtfully. "I always do." "I know you do." He looked back down at the engine. "I don't ever want you to think I forgot." My throat tightened. Kids notice far more than adults give them credit for. Late one rainy Friday evening, just as I finished locking my front door, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Michael stood on my porch alone. No Emily, no anger, no excuses, just a tired man who looked older than his 38 years. He held a plain white envelope in one hand. "Dad," he said quietly, "can we talk?" He stepped aside without saying a word. So many conversations take weeks to begin. Others take a lifetime. He had a feeling this one was both. Michael stood in my entryway, holding the plain white envelope so tightly that the edges had begun to wrinkle. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired you fix with a good night's sleep. The kind that settles into a person's face after weeks of stress, regret, and consequences finally catching up. He stepped aside. "Come in." He nodded. "Thanks." He noticed immediately that he had come alone. Emily wasn't in the driveway. There wasn't a second car parked down the street, just Michael. That alone told me this wasn't another attempt to pressure me. He made coffee. Out of habit, I reached for 2 mugs instead of 1. Susan always believed difficult conversations deserved fresh coffee. "Sit." Michael lowered himself into the kitchen chair where he'd sat hundreds of times growing up. Only this time, he looked more like the frightened teenager who'd once come home after totaling his first car than the confident businessman who'd shrugged at me on Christmas morning. He stared at the envelope. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Did any of them go well?" He managed the smallest smile. "No, I didn't think so." Several long seconds passed. Finally, he slid the envelope across the table. "I wanted you to have this." Inside was a cashier's check. $8,743.18. The exact amount charged to my credit card. He looked up. "You didn't have to bring this today." "Yes, I did." He studied his face. There was something different. Not confidence, humility, a quality I'd almost forgotten he possessed. "I sold my boat, the fishing boat," he nodded, "and my motorcycle." He knew how much he loved both. "I also canceled the ski trip Emily and I had planned." He looked down at his hands. "I should have done this week's cycle." He quietly folded the check back into the envelope. "I'm glad you did." He took a deep breath. "Dad, I owe you more than money." He waited. "I owe you the truth." Those words mattered more than the check. "Go ahead." He rubbed both palms together. "I kept telling myself I wasn't taking advantage of you." "What changed?" "I started adding everything up." He laughed bitterly. "The college loans, the house, the business, the daycare, the medical bills, the tuition. A shook his head. I always remembered each one separately. A looked directly at me. I never added them together. You should. I did. His voice cracked. I couldn't believe how much you'd done. A leaned back in his chair. You know what the worst part is? What? I honestly expected you'd always be there. I was. No. A shook his head. I expected you to solve things. It paused. When the business deal started falling apart after the trust changed, I wasn't angry because I lost the deal. You weren't. I was angry because for the first time in my adult life, he swallowed hard. I realized I'd built my future assuming your money would eventually become mine. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a response. It simply needs room to exist. After several minutes, he quietly said, I became entitled. It was the first time I'd heard him use the word himself. He hated admitting it. I imagine you did. I kept blaming Christmas. A laughed softly. But Christmas wasn't the problem. No, it was everything before Christmas. He nodded. Exactly. Michael looked around the kitchen. So many memories. You practically grew up at this table. I remember Mom making pancakes every Saturday. So do I, he smiled sadly. I've been thinking about her a lot. So have I. I stared out the window. I think she'd be disappointed in me. He answered honestly. She'd be disappointed, he nodded. But she'd also want you to become better. Tears filled his eyes. I hope so. After a while, he asked the question I'd been expecting. Did you really remove us from the trust? I did. He nodded slowly. I figured. He didn't argue. Didn't they accuse me of overreacting? Instead, he simply asked, will you ever put us back? He took my time answering. I don't know. His shoulders lowered. I understand. I don't owe you an inheritance. I know, but I do owe you honesty. He looked at me. Trust isn't restored because someone says they're sorry. He tapped the envelope gently. It isn't restored because they repay money either. What restores it? Dime. He nodded. I was afraid you'd say that. Why? Because time can't be rushed. No, it can't. He took another sip of coffee. I've started meeting with a financial planner. That's good. I canceled 3 credit cards. Also good. We sold Emily's SUV. He raised an eyebrow. The new one? Couldn't they afford it? He smiled weakly. Turns out we never really could. What about Emily? He hesitated. We've been arguing about the trust, about everything, he sighed. She kept saying we'd eventually inherit enough that none of it mattered. He looked embarrassed. And I realized, he paused. I'd been saying the same thing for years. That admission hurt. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed what I'd slowly begun to suspect. A few days later, Emily called. Unlike the last conversation, there was no cheerful voice asking for money. She sounded nervous. Can we meet? If you'd like. She came over the following afternoon. She carried no designer handbag, no expensive jewelry, just a small bakery box. I baked these. He smiled. You didn't have to. I know. She looked around awkwardly. I'd never actually baked before. The cookies were slightly burned. Susan would have laughed. He almost did. Emily looked at me with tears in her eyes. I've been angry with you. I know, but mostly. She looked down. I've been angry with myself. She admitted she'd always viewed me as the family's financial safety net. Not the person, not intentionally, just gradually. So, when we wanted something, she whispered. Asking you felt easier than sacrificing. That sentence lingered with me. Asking you felt easier than sacrificing. How many families quietly live that way? Over the next few months, I watched changes instead of promises. Michael picked up consulting work on weekends. Emily returned to teaching full-time. They downsized vacations, canceled luxury memberships, stopped replacing perfectly good things just because newer versions appeared. More importantly, the requests stopped. No emergency calls, no unexpected bills, no hints about money. Sometimes Michael would stop by just to mow my lawn or help clean the gutters. The first time he did, I reached for my wallet. He gently pushed my hand away. I'm your son, he smiled. I should have been doing this all along. Spring slowly turned into summer. One humid afternoon, my mailbox held another white envelope. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line simply read, Dad, this isn't another apology. It's an accounting. Over several pages, Michael listed every time I'd helped him throughout his life. Every check, every sacrifice, every moment he'd taken for granted. At the very end, he wrote, For years, I believed you gave me money because you had plenty. I finally understand you gave it because you love me. E.